This deeply rooted sense of God was something expressed as a physical feeling by many of the core members, including Marshall.
Answer. I reply. I really want to finish. Absolutely.
My research partners gave powerful examples of how deeply embodied, deeply rooted the spirituality of people with intellectual disabilities is. Although this gift is not exclusive to core members, within this study, what became obvious was how people with intellectual disabilities seem to be particularly able to share this gift with the church, and to remind the church of the importance of our call to help integrate people's spirituality with all aspects of their lives. The openness that was named as a gift of people with intellectual disabilities brings us to our second theme.
Tyrion says, there is just a level of openness, a level of sensitivity that I've learned from my relationships with people with disabilities. And I think the church can learn that too.
One thing that emerged from these interviews, directly and indirectly, is that there is a gift that accompanies spending time with core members.
That gift is the call to authenticity and the importance of belonging.
Tyrion, an assistant, talks about how people bring their whole selves to prayer at the Lars Chapel. He says, everything has to be a bit down to earth if people are going to interrupt, and they're going to talk, and they're going to fart, and someone else is going to laugh at the fart. You can't get too fancy. I appreciate that. What became evident in the words of my research partners is that to build a strong relationship with God, we must be willing to be vulnerable enough to expose our authentic selves. Samuel, who was an assistant at L'Arche for many years, says,
I think there is godliness in vulnerability, and often the way we connect to each other and we connect to God is through our own vulnerability and the way that God knows to be vulnerable. And people with intellectual disabilities are a living witness of that.
my partner spoke of the beauty of being around people who act out their joy by dancing, or someone who cries out when they're sad, or expresses their agitation in church, seeking out someone else's presence and a gentle touch. When this happens, we are all reminded of our authentic humanness. And it is within this vulnerable humanity where we build deep, extraordinary relationship with God and also with each other. And that is the work of the church, right? Samuel speaks about his relationship with a core member who I will call Paul. Samuel says, Paul comes to mind a lot as someone who just really shaped me. And I just think that being in relationship with him helped me to realize how vulnerable I am. And that opened me to God in a significant way. And I think it's actually one of his gifts. Beth shares that L'Arche has something to teach churches. She says she believes that churches are yearning for perfection in the presentation. And we don't look for that here in community, she says. We look for what you can give. We look for you to say yes.
Somebody once told me there is no room for God in perfection. And ever since then, it's sort of my mantra, because my history has been one of wanting to do things in a way where there wasn't room for God. And so I have to be constantly alert to that.
Beth spoke about the connection between freedom to be your true self and deep relationship with God. She talked about those unexpected moments of ministry in church when somebody keeps putting up her hand because it's somebody's birthday in her house and she wants to acknowledge that this individual is being celebrated today.
You know, those unexpected moments, which can often be interpreted as disruptive. But when people feel that they belong, they are not interruptions. They are news announcements. They are sharings. It is an extraordinary thing to feel like you belong, like you are loved for who you really are. The church is called to mirror this unconditional love of God, and my research partners spoke again and again of the importance for the church to help people experience this feeling.
Throughout the interviews, people spoke about how the experience of being loved with all their gifts and their challenges has helped them on their faith journey. People with intellectual disabilities call us into authenticity. My partners shared the wisdom that the church needs to let go of formality and the striving for perfection, and instead create space for God moments to break through in unexpected ways.
Relationships with God are deepened when people feel that they belong, and the church is called to help people experience being loved as their whole selves.
Another theme that emerged from the wisdom of my research was the importance of creating a worship experience that is for and by everyone.
Hillary, a core member, shared that church didn't meet her at her level.
I don't go to church anymore because I find it boring. Maybe church needs to get more people involved. Maybe have sermons that are more exciting. And don't use big, huge words anymore that some people can't understand.
Beth, who is a spiritual life coordinator in her community, spoke about the richness of coming up with ways of engaging everyone. She says, "We attempt to be inclusive. So whether you have somebody who might be hearing impaired or someone who doesn't use words to communicate, whatever it is, we are constantly challenged in looking at how we are able to include everyone who comes in." Samuel said that some core members, including Drogon, do not live at the level of verbal language most of the time. And being able to mimic and being swept up into the drama helped him to belong. It helps him to be included and helps him to lead, actually.
These changes to worship, to make it more experiential and engaging for all the senses, is not just important at L'Arche, but in the church as well, as it can be a rich experience for all people. Samuel said, "It's a bit like how curb cuts aren't just good for people who use wheelchairs, but they're good for people who use strollers and use grocery carts. And you know, when you make something more accessible for a person, or a particular type of person, it works for a lot of other people too." Through my interview, some very practical suggestions were made of ways to move beyond words in worship. Some of the ideas raised were the use of songs that have actions or are short and repetitive, so are easy for everyone to learn and join in. Beth reflected on the place of story in worship and said, "A really good story engages people in ways that a very formulated sermon doesn't quite hit, you know?" My participants spoke of the intentional use of movement, the incorporation of mime or sign language, even if it's just a few simple signs. How PowerPoint or videos can be used as a visual reference or to illustrate a theme. The incorporation of dance. For example, Maria is part of a group who helps to lead worship through dance. At Lisa's ordination service, her group danced to the song "How Can I Keep From Singing" as they processed the gospel to the front. There was an emphasis on the importance of creating a space to be silent together. Samuel shared, "There is just something, especially when living with people who are nonverbal. Sharing the silence together is really meaningful." The inclusion of all people may look like inviting everyone to light a candle, or giving everyone an object to hold, or participation in collaborative art. For some people, these non-verbal elements create an experience of God more than words ever could.
Nana Mac told a story about a nonverbal young man with autism who regularly attends her church, and she has a desire to help him participate in worship. She says, I think there are ways of including him in the prayers because he has a board that speaks. But she laments, when he comes to church, he doesn't bring it with him. He literally has no voice in worship. She also had examples for the church in how space can be created for all voices. Nana Mac spoke of the importance of involving everyone in planning by rotating leadership. She said, we try to have something that reflects on the theme that people can be part of, whether it's sharing around a question or whether it's a physical activity where you bring things forward and they become part of prayer. What became clear is that when worship is created by all voices, it becomes a collaborative experience that is deeply meaningful for all involved.
Tyrion says, there is something about the prayer life that we share at L'Arche that when I go to a church service, it just seems like it's in black and white, and the stuff we do at chapel is in color somehow.
The fourth theme is about breaking open worship to all ministries. Often the churches try to find people to fill positions that need filling. So perhaps you're looking for a lay reader, and you might ask people who are good readers if they could do it.
I heard lots of stories about how people with disabilities were able to fill these important roles in the church, although not always in the traditional ways. Samuel told a story about a time he and Drogon, who speaks in a language that is uniquely his, were attending church. Samuel was tapped on the shoulder and asked if he would be a lay reader. He and Drogon went forward together.
Samuel said, I would point to the book in the pulpit and Drogon would read. He would read it in his language and then I would read it in my language. He was really involved, and it was really meaningful for me. I think it was really meaningful for him, and also the people.
It sort of breaks through. It just makes the service come alive in a new way when they see something out of the ordinary.
Tyrion spoke about how his son who has Down syndrome would get in trouble in church for trying to pull the bell that hung in the sanctuary and rang the church bell. Eventually, the church made bell ringer his special job. Tyrion said, people appreciate those things so much. They feel good about finding ways to incorporate people like that, even if it's not done quite right. Nana Mac and Marshall shared about how it took a lot of time and convincing, but eventually Marshall was welcomed as a member of their church council. During her time on council, Marshall was able to give a perspective that has not often been heard in their church. There were lots of examples of how people with disabilities were able to share their gifts and fill these important roles within the church. But there was also a suggestion that we are actually doing this all backwards.
Samuel says, there's a more radical way, I think. That is allowing the service itself to change in response to the people that are involved, as opposed to slotting people into pre-cut holes.
It is about looking beyond the ordinary and providing the time and space for the ministries of people with disabilities to change the church. Tyrion, a long-term L'Arche assistant, said, the things that most of the people who we know can do are pretty paltry. To carry a plate up to the front or pass out pamphlets at the back, to shake hands and say peace, or to sing along. They're pretty small actions. And so the biggest ministry that people with intellectual disabilities can have in the church is the ministry of presence. And I think if they are present,
if the church listens and searches for ways that they can become leaders and that their gifts can be revealed, that the church will naturally kind of form around these people in a way that makes it a better church.
The richness that comes from inviting people to discern and share their God-given gifts with the church has the potential to break open worship and allow people to truly experience the Holy Spirit.